The night was dark and humid as Mark Dawson, a local cab driver, drove down Route 46, a long stretch of road that cut through the dense Louisiana swamps. His shift was almost over, but something about this night felt different. The road was unusually quiet, and his radio kept slipping into static. His taxi was the only thing moving under the flickering streetlights. The sky was moonless, and mist curled around the edges of the road like ghostly fingers. He turned up the volume on his radio, but it only produced a low hum, as if whispering back at him. Just as he reached a narrow bridge, he spotted a figure standing near the guardrail. It was a woman in a white dress, her long, dark hair hanging over her face. She wasn't waving. Mark's fingers tightened on the wheel. He'd heard stories of hitchhikers along this road, some of them leading to strange disappearances. But leaving a lone woman on the road at this hour didn't feel right either. He slowly pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice slightly shaky. The woman didn't reply, but simply walked to the back door and slid into the seat without a sound. As she sat, a peculiar scent filled the car, a mix of roses and damp earth. It was strong, almost suffocating. The woman kept her head low, hands resting in her lap, not speaking a word. Trying to mask his discomfort, Mark asked, "Where to, ma'am?" For a long moment, silence. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, "Just drive." Mark shifted the car into gear and started driving. The road ahead seemed endless, the yellow lines disappearing into the mist. He glanced at his GPS, but the screen flickered strangely, showing no route information. Something felt off. Mark checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see her face, but he saw nothing. The back seat was empty. A sharp breath left his lips. He turned his head quickly. The woman was still there, sitting completely still, hands folded, head slightly tilted. A loud knock came from inside the back seat. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Knock, knock, knock. The temperature in the car dropped suddenly. Mark's breath came out in small puffs of mist. He reached for the radio, but all he heard was distorted whispers mixed with static. Another 3 knocks echoed from the back. The woman hadn't moved, but Mark felt a presence now, something unseen sitting next to her. The rearview mirror changed. The woman's head slowly turned toward it, and when her face finally came into view, her mouth was stretched into an unnaturally wide grin. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. The whole car shook as if something outside was trying to get in, or something inside was trying to get out. In a breathless whisper, she said, "You've been here before." Mark slammed the brakes. The road ahead was no longer the highway. Somehow he had driven onto a dirt path leading to an old graveyard. His hands were shaking as he turned to the back seat. She was gone. The door hadn't opened. The seat was cold. Only the scent of roses and damp soil remained. He pressed the gas, but the car wouldn't budge. The headlights flickered, and shadows moved between the headstones of the graveyard. Then, just as his heart pounded against his ribs, he heard it again. 3 knocks. But this time, they came from the driver's side window. Mark turned his head slowly. A pale, wet hand was pressed against the glass. Behind it, the woman's face, grinning too wide, her hollow black eyes staring right at him. He slammed the gas again, and this time the car lurched forward. The woman's face disappeared in the rearview mirror, but something inside him knew this wasn't over. When Mark finally made it home, he checked the time. 3 a.m., the witching hour. He locked the doors and collapsed onto his bed, but he couldn't sleep. Just as his eyes began to close, a slow knock echoed from his bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. Mark sat up, his skin crawling. His apartment was empty. He lived alone. But in the hallway, he saw a shadow. The next night, Mark's phone rang at exactly 3 a.m. The screen showed no caller ID. When he answered, a breathless whisper came through. "You left me there." On the 3rd night, Mark swore he wouldn't sleep, but at 3 a.m., his phone buzzed again. This time, a text message. "I'm outside." He peeked through the window. His taxi was parked outside. The keys were inside. The engine was running, and in the back seat, she was waiting. The car door opened by itself. Mark felt a cold hand on his shoulder. A voice whispered, "Time to finish the ride." The next morning, Mark's taxi was found abandoned at Hollow Creek Cemetery. The doors were locked. The engine was off. The only thing inside was a single white flower on the driver's seat. The police officer who found Mark's taxi at Hollow Creek Cemetery was confused. The car was locked, the engine off, and the only thing left inside was a white rose on the driver's seat, but no sign of Mark. Mark's disappearance spread through the small Louisiana town. Some believed he ran away, but others whispered old ghost stories about the cursed road where he had picked up his last fare. Jake, Mark's closest friend and fellow taxi driver, refused to believe the ghost stories. He knew Mark was scared of something, but ghosts? That was ridiculous. Detectives searching through town records found something disturbing. Mark wasn't the first to vanish near Hollow Creek Cemetery. In 1963, a similar case happened. A taxi driver picked up a woman in white and was never seen again. 1 week later, Jake took a late-night fare along the same stretch of road where Mark disappeared. He didn't believe in ghosts, but that night, he saw her, standing in the exact same spot. Jake didn't stop. He gripped the steering wheel, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But then, knock, knock, knock. From his passenger side window, his taxi's GPS glitched, the screen filling with static before displaying a single word: return. Jake's breath hitched. He heard a voice, the same whisper that Mark described before disappearing. It came from the back seat, even though the car was empty. "You left me there." Something touched him. Cold, clammy fingers pressed against his shoulder. He swerved off the road in terror. When he looked up, Jake realized he had driven onto a dirt road leading to the cemetery. His taxi had brought him here, just like Mark, determined to understand what was happening. Jake started researching. He uncovered the real identity of the woman in white, Mary Lou Castor, a woman who had died in 1963. Mary Lou had disappeared after taking a taxi home one rainy night. Days later, they found her body in the swamp, her hands bruised, as if she had been knocking on something or trying to get out. Her driver had never been found. Some say he left town in guilt. Others believe he never made it out of the car. After Mary Lou's death, the story goes, every few years, a taxi driver picks her up and vanishes. Jake wasn't ready to be next. He decided to face the ghost head-on and return to the cursed road at night. At exactly 3 a.m., he parked his taxi at the same spot where Mark had disappeared. He waited. The air turned ice cold. The scent of roses and damp earth filled the car. Then, she was there, sitting in the back seat. Jake gritted his teeth as the knocking began. This time, it wasn't just on the seat. It was on the windows, the dashboard, the doors. This time, she spoke clearly, her voice echoing. "You left me there. Take me home." The GPS, which had been stuck on unknown, suddenly displayed a new route, a road that didn't exist anymore. Jake followed the glowing route, his hands trembling. The road changed. It was no longer paved, but old, cracked stone, as if he was driving back in time. The trees on the roadside began to blur, replaced by old streetlights and 1960s cars parked along the sidewalk. He was no longer in 2025. Mary Lou never looked at him. Her long black hair hid her expression, but her fingers twitched on her lap. The GPS led him to a broken-down house at the edge of town. Its windows were boarded up, but the front door was open, waiting. For the first time, she moved on her own. She opened the door and stepped out, but before she entered the house, she turned to look at Jake. Jake finally saw her fully. Her face was pale and lifeless, her mouth too wide, her eyes black and hollow. But there were tears streaming down her cheeks. She whispered those words with a grateful but eerie smile. Then she disappeared into the house. As soon as she entered, the house crumbled into dust. Where it once stood, there was only an old tombstone. Jake stepped closer. The tombstone read, "Mary Lou Castor, 1940 to 1963. She just wanted to go home." The taxi's engine rumbled. The GPS returned to normal. The air smelled normal again. Jake had survived, but as he turned back to his car, He saw something in the rearview mirror. Jake's breath hitched as he stared at the white rose lying on the back seat. His heart pounded. Hadn't Mary Lou moved on? The old, broken-down house was gone, replaced by a quiet, overgrown lot. The road was back to normal, with no sign of the eerie 1960s setting he had driven through. Jake checked the news the next day. There was no record of Mark's disappearance. It was as if it had never happened. The ghost stories of Route 46 were gone. Jake sat at the diner where he and Mark used to have coffee. The waitress Maggie asked, "You look lost, hun. You okay?" Jake hesitated. "Do you remember Mark Dawson?" She frowned. "Who?" That night, Jake decided to quit driving taxis. He locked his cab in the garage and swore never to drive that road again. But at exactly 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. A text message from Mark's number. "It's not over." Before Jake could even react, knock, 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 loud and deliberate, from inside the garage. He rushed to the garage. The taxi's engine was running, but he had the keys in his pocket. The headlights flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Jake forced himself to open the back door. The white rose was gone, but the scent of roses and damp earth lingered. As he turned away, a chilling whisper brushed his ear. "See you soon." Days later, Jake's taxi was found abandoned on Route 46. The driver's seat was empty, and there were no footprints leading away. On the back seat, a single white rose lay perfectly in the center. The police officer investigating the scene had a strange sense of déjà vu, as if this had happened before. Months later, a new taxi driver named Ethan Carter took the night shift on Route 46. He had never heard of Jake. He had never heard of Mark. One stormy night, Ethan spotted a woman in white standing near the old bridge. Something about her felt wrong, but he was too tired to think straight. She opened the back door and got in without speaking. The scent of roses and damp earth filled the car. Ethan glanced at her through the rearview mirror, feeling a deep sense of unease. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. She finally spoke. "Just drive." The GPS glitched, the screen flickering strangely. It displayed a familiar word: return. As Ethan gripped the wheel, a chill ran down his spine. Then, knock, knock, knock. From inside the back seat, his hands started shaking. He adjusted the rearview mirror. The woman's head tilted unnaturally to one side, her smile too wide. Louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. The taxi lurched forward, as if something else had taken control of the wheel. The woman leaned forward, her breath cold against Ethan's ear. "You left me there." The next morning, Ethan's taxi was found abandoned near Hollow Creek Cemetery. No sign of the driver, no footprints, just a single white rose. The story would repeat, over and over. Every few years, a taxi driver picks up the woman in white, and every few years, the driver disappears. The townspeople never speak of the road's curse. They forget the missing drivers. It's as if the town itself is part of the secret.